too much evil. What then we call evil, pain of body and mind, is an inseparable part of the great whole of human life. If this solution is not altogether consolatory, one thing is clear, that it excludes certain other imaginary solutions. We cannot say, as the old Persian theology is reputed to have said, that good and evil are the creation of two antagonistic spirits. Being parts of one scheme, if we introduce two or more creative spirits, we must, at all events, presume that they acted in harmony. A spirit of being, itself created by another, cannot, of course, be the original author of evil. There is no resistance to our will which may not, in some sense, be pronounced to be an evil, and yet the very exercise of power implies the idea of resistance. You could not even wield the stick within your hand, unless it presented a resistance to your hand. All moral or mental power is exhibited by conquering some resistance, some error, or some misplaced passion. Is this necessary presence of some element we call by the name of evil inconsistent with the idea of progress? By no means. We diminish the amount and alter the nature of our evils. We exalt, we multiply what is good. Nor is there any fear that by our progress we should deprive our energies of their needful stimulant of dreaded evil. For, say, some misery like that of poverty, or that form of disease which originates in foul air and bad food, should by wise cooperation be kept at bay. The enemy is still at our gates, and will return upon us, if we remit our vigilance. We may have built our dikes, and won a smiling territory from the wasteful sea, but unless we also keep our dikes in repair, the ocean will be on us again, and inflict far more misery than it could have done before we had our conquest. It is worth noticing that, as we advance in knowledge and in arts, we act more and more on prospective or precautionary grounds, and less from the immediate stimulant of pain or want, and our impulses partake more largely of hope than of fear. Yes, yes, I think I hear my impatient reader exclaim. We admit all this. Pain, the conservator of life, the stimulant to action, the exalter of pleasure by the contrast it supplies, could not be dispensed with. We admit, too, that every heroism in the world would fall flat unless supported by its antagonistic evil. And we clearly perceive that our highest thoughts and emotions are in part composed of grief and indignation, sorrow and disappointment. All the fine arts, as well as the virtues, eloquence, poetry, and music, claim kindred to sorrow as well as to joy. We admit all this, but we say that there is too much of this element of evil. It seems to us that there is much bodily pain and much torture of mind that might so easily be spared. If there is no nerve, sometimes yielding pleasure and sometimes pain, which should venture to eradicate from our system, we cannot but think that the conditions of life might be so modified as to call forth less frequently its faculty of suffering. If there is no passion, we could altogether erase without degrading the entire man. There is surely a disproportionate intensity of many of them, from which we might be relieved. There is too much evil. Passions are too violent. Wants are too agonizing. Pains and distresses are too numerous, too persistent, too intense. The complaint is natural. Who of us has not made it the day of his sorrow or his indignation? But consider this, that it lies in the very nature of pain and suffering, that we do and must complain of it. Whatever the degree in which it presents itself, it must always seem too much. It is always, from the nature of the case, the element we wish away, that stands out against us as repugnant and superfluous. No animal, and certainly not man himself, could be trusted with the modification or reconstruction of his own life. He would at once and forever reject what is repugnant, and in so doing, unnerve his whole existence. Every animal that has to seek its food with bargain for a regular supply and near at hand. Yet with those who have great powers of locomotion, the irregularity and uncertainty of supply is connected with the exercise of their peculiar faculties. What would become of all the birds of the air, with the glory of their outstretched and untiring pinions, if it were not for that seeming precariousness of supply, which doubtless they would themselves complain of, and which even benevolent men have contemplated with some dismay and distress? We men, for our own parts, are in the habit of saying that it is well for us, that we cannot always predict the future, that there should be abundant play for hope and curiosity and surprise. Nevertheless, this uncertainty is a state which each one for himself would constantly remove if he could. He must wish to read the future while he is still in the anxious present. That there is a general feeling of too much evil is not, therefore, a proof that this element is in excess, viewed as part of the whole, because, from its nature, it is always that which is felt to be too much. Nevertheless, this question of degree is one which may legitimately be raised, if only one could grapple with it. A calm and all-seeing spectator of human affairs might discuss such a question. We stand ourselves in this predicament, if our knowledge is not sufficient to enable us to pronounce that it is not in excess, an opinion to which, from the general harmony of nature, one may be disposed to lean. It is certainly not sufficient to entitle us to assert that it is in excess. How can man, the sufferer, trust himself to form any decision upon the degree in which pain and pleasure should be diffused over the whole world? How can he know that passions less violent, wants less painful, distresses less extensive, would have answered the purposes for which passion, want, and distress have been called in? He knows this, that he should always give his judgment in favor of the something less. I ask of no man to be contented with the amount of evil existing at any time, in any age or country. It is the nature of evil to prompt opposition to it. The more intelligence there is in man, the more vigorous and effectual the opposition it will prompt. The greatest of all calamities is the contentment that sits down at peace with irremediable evil. But how can I measure the degree of that stimulant necessary to call forth those energies by which we progress? It would be very hard to grapple with this question of degree. Let me recall the effect produced by the political economists, with Malthus at their head, demonstrating the tendency of population to outstrip the means of subsistence. To keep this tendency in check has appeared to some reasoners the great problem, or the great despair of sociology. But all men, and certainly all political economists, must admit that the tendency of population to press upon the means of subsistence has been, and still is, a most essential stimulant to the labor and ingenuity of man. The tendency, you say, is too strong. Who has proved that it is too strong? It is most desirable that a people who have come to the age of reflection, and amongst whom industry no longer requires the immediate spur of want, should be called upon to exercise prudence in the matter of marriage. And we see that its attention is called to this momentous subject, and a suitable modification of the moral opinion of society is taking place. But who shall say that the tendency by which population increases has been too strong for the purposes it has had to accomplish? By it, the earth has been peopled, has been cultivated, and the colonization of uninhabited regions still depends on this pressure of population upon subsistence. And we see that when men become calculating and prudent in other matters, they become prudent in this matter also. We know that the pressure of population upon food is far less severe in thickly peopled and industrious countries than amongst the scanty populations of semi-barbarous regions. On the whole, we may safely assert that this pressure becomes less and less painful, just as it becomes less and less the imperative motive of human industry. The same increasing intelligence which enriches and exalts human life will prevent its own work from being destroyed by a too great flood of population. The alarm has been sounded, not prematurely, because it must take many ages before all ranks of society can be reached by it, but quite in time, for the civilized nations of Europe have still large territory open to them, delicious climates and fruitful soils, both to the east and to the west. Nor can it be known how far their own soil admits of improved culture. A thinly inhabited country may feel the pinch of hunger as severely as a more populous country. Say that in this early stage it had sought relief by limiting its population. It would forever have remained a thinly inhabited, poor, and uncivilized country. Passions, you say, are too violent. Certainly in this or that man too violent, in that other perhaps too feeble. No one is in all respects a perfect character, and here we encounter another of nature's great beneficent laws or tendencies. Everywhere variety. Throughout all the animal creation, what endless variety. One type is seen to be developing itself into every possible modification, and between man and man, between mind and mind, the same inexhaustible variety. Nothing is apt to strike us with more admiration than this diversity of human character, coupled as it is with certain great similitudes. And if these great resemblances between man and man are absolutely necessary for the foundation of any society, or any code of morals, since if the same thing did not generally give pleasure and pain, there could be no general law for human conduct. It is equally true that differences between man and man give to all human societies their vivacity, their movement, and the mental activity that distinguishes them. I half suspect that, if a man were suddenly to be plunged into a society where everyone was exactly like himself, he would go mad. The ennui would be intolerable, losing all sense of contrast. He would be in danger of losing his sense of individuality. His very personality would grow dim to him. Be that as it may, this variety of character, of powers, temperaments, habits, is of infinite importance and essential to the progress of humanity. And how could this variety exist if in every individual the passions were mingled in what we should pronounce perfect proportions? The existence of this diversity of human character is manifestly incompatible with the frequent attainment of an ideal standard of perfection. One man is strict in calling others to account, vindictive in his justice, earnest in punishing offenders. Too earnest, you say, too vindictive. But his amiable neighbor is too lenient, too compassionate, or else, out of very indolence, far too ready to forgive offenses by which he does not personally suffer. The vindictiveness of the one is balanced by the amiability or indolence of the other. Much better, you say, that all should have the same temperate and unyielding sentiment of public justice, by which laws for the public welfare are sustained. But how expect the same energetic yet equitable sentiment in men of different tempers, who have been, moreover, subjected to the also beneficially varied circumstances of life? Sometimes the one character is plainly the complement of the other, as where one man is submissive and claims guidance and protection, and another is of the dominating order, exercising control and skillful in organizing. Do considerations of this kind lead us to tolerate all character, alike good and bad, kind and cruel? Not at all. There are certain great subjects on which men think and feel sufficiently alike to form a strong moral opinion, which is constantly coercing individual peculiarities or eccentricities. Coupled with this diversity of character is a general acceptance of certain great truths, and a general desire to force these truths upon our neighbors. We conclude, therefore, that the too much of pain and painful emotion can only be asserted by one who, after surveying the whole of human life, could confidently pronounce that a less degree of that which in any degree is odious would have been equally compatible with all the advantages that are complicated with pain and painful emotions. Moral evil. Perhaps the reader relinquishes this question of degree and limits his objection or his perplexity to one kind of evil. Moral evil, crime, sin. Pain and painful emotions he can understand as having a fit place in God's creation. Do they not practice us in fortitude and other virtues? But pain given with vicious intention by one man to another, this must surely be attributed to some diabolic agency. How can the God who punishes sin have also ordained its existence? How reconcile our notions of the justice of God with the belief that man in all respects the creature of God? This, with many minds, is the great difficulty that besets our subject. That which, amongst animals or idiots, is mere hurt and injury, becomes moral evil, becomes crime or sin, to intelligent man occupied with the interests of society or the presumed judgments of God. Evil, therefore, becomes moral evil. How? By the development of human reason, and a pleasure-giving act becomes moral goodness by the same development of intelligence. We have not here to speak of any absolutely new passion. What has converted evil into moral evil is the elevation of other parts of our nature. The intentional acts of men become moral evil because they are performed or contemplated by beings capable of moral judgments. Whether you pronounce these judgments to be the result of a special moral faculty or describe them as the reason judging for the welfare of the whole community, it is still sufficiently plain that evil becomes moral evil by the addition of these judgments. It is the result of this higher or peculiar development of the human mind that to injure another, under certain circumstances, becomes moral evil. We see this by simple statement the utter impossibility of ascribing simple pain or evil to the Creator of the world, and moral evil to some other and diabolic agent. The evil being there, the conversion of it into moral evil marked our advancement. You say that the passions, motives, energies of man ought to be uniformly controlled by reason or conscience. Why, then, has a world been formed in which they are not always so controlled? But unless there had been passions needing control, capable of leading to violent and mischievous actions, how could this moral restraint have been brought into existence? It is because we have to check and regulate both ourselves and each other that there is such a thing as morality at all. No theorem in Euclid is more clear than this, that moral good and moral evil start into existence together. Reason and conscience are themselves developments from the experience of the good and evil of life. The moment reason and conscience are thus developed, good and evil have become moral good and moral evil. The creation of man as a moral being involves the necessity of moral evil. Let us first suppose that all men acted spontaneously, whether from instinct or perfectly balanced passions, in that manner which was best for the whole. Here it is plain there would be no room for the development of our moral sentiments. A perfect code of morality might be acted, but not from the sentiments of moral responsibility, duty, merit. Rules of conduct would be as unnecessary to such a race as to the ant or the bee. There would be no conflict between the present passion or immediate interest of the individual and the reason judging for the interest of the whole community. Conscience, describe it how you will, would be latent, undeveloped. Let us next suppose that there was such amount of irregularity and mischief in the spontaneous actions of men as to develop the conscience, as to suggest the making of laws or rules, and affixing a penalty of some kind to their infraction. And let us suppose that the moment such rules were made, the moment that conscience was developed, and good and bad conduct became, therefore, right and wrong conduct, that all the bad conduct now stigmatized as wrong, vicious, immoral, immediately ceased. Here obedience to the rule is supposed at once to become universal, at once to reach its maximum in every individual. But who sees not that the supposition is utterly at variance with all the great facts of human nature, with the force of habit, with the gradual formation of definite and universally received laws? And if such a violent supposition could be gravely discussed, if the moment a moral judgment were formed, the evil on which it pronounced altogether ceased, I am at a loss to conceive how, in such a state of things, where all would be equally obedient to the moral law, there could be any feeling of merit, any glow of virtue, any praise given or received. Granting that such a uniformity of moral conduct is desirable, it is plainly impossible that it could be produced suddenly. What in the nature of things is founded on experience must be preceded by the requisite experience. If a race of thinking beings is to act from a rule of reason or intelligence, that is, from generalized experience, there must have been a process of thought or experiment carried on through several generations. Man injures himself and his fellow man by his ignorance and passion. From many ill results of these he learns temperance, he learns equity. These virtues are, from their very nature, to be learnt from the experience of good and evil, and will be learned gradually. Turn the subject how you will. Moral good could not exist unless its counterpart of moral evil also existed, or had existed. This truth is self-evident, and yet it seems to be overlooked by those who repeatedly perplex themselves by asking, how could God be the author of moral evil? The great fact that ought to arrest their attention is that God has been the author of a moral being. He has so arranged the circumstances of life and the powers and propensities of man that the reason or judgment cultivated in this scene of pain and pleasure produces for us the sentiments of merit and duty. I repeat that no refuge can be taken in any peculiar ethical theory. Natural evil, says one reasoner, becomes moral evil because it is at once felt to be such. Man has a moral perception, an original faculty of conscience, by means of which he perceives certain conduct to be right and wrong, just as by his ordinary organs of perception he perceives things to be blue or red, round or square. In my apprehension, what is here called an original faculty of conscience is the judgment of our conduct according to the rules that have grown up as the reason and affections of man develop themselves. I have explained this elsewhere and may again find it necessary to go over this beaten yet intricate ground of ethical discussion. But adopt, if you can understand it, this theory of an innate moral perception. It is still clear that this faculty could not have its proper exercise, could not be developed, unless there were presented before it both moral evil and moral good. That natural evil has become moral evil is the sign of man's advancement and immense superiority above all other living creatures. Beasts injure and destroy each other, and we call this a natural evil. It would be like natural evil in man, but that his higher reason condemns it. He compares such injury and destruction with peaceful and beneficent conduct. He approves the one, condemns the other. God, then, is the author of moral evil. In what way? By the development of the reason of man. He has enabled him to compare conduct with conduct, result with result, enabled him to approve and condemn. All this is very clear. But why then, it is asked, does God punish moral evil if he created it? There are two theories abroad on the nature of divine punishment. If the divine punishments, whether judicial or consisting of penalties brought out by the operation of the laws already established, have for their end the guidance of men and of societies of men, here or hereafter, then these divine punishments are but means to carry on the progressive development of the human species. The whole scheme is still in harmony in all its parts. There is no difficulty in God's both creating and punishing moral evil. He creates it by the additional intelligence he gives to man. That is, he has raised in man a desire to combat evil. He fosters or enlightens that desire by affixing penalties where man has declined this combat. If, according to another theory, God punishes sin simply because it is sin, simply from a supposed repugnance or hostility to moral evil, without any regard to the results of punishment, then I admit that it is impossible to reconcile such notions of God's justice with the fact that God is the creator of the world. But this last theory of divine punishments is not, I believe, the one generally received. Perhaps in the general mind there is some confused notion of retributive justice, which would be found difficult to reconcile with the faith equally general, that God made all mankind and the whole of our humanity. But the theory that God, from the necessity of his nature, must punish sin as sin, without regard to the beneficent result of the punishment itself, is one which would be only formally set forth by a peculiar class of theologians. It matters not, however, whether that class of theologians be large or small. It is a theory utterly irreconcilable with the belief in one supreme, creative, and beneficent intelligence. In one sense of the word, God creates no evil. I said that I had no paradox to put forward, yet the conclusion to which we are inevitably led can hardly be expressed in terms which do not sound paradoxical. There is no evil in the sum of things, no evil in the relation which any one thing bears to the great whole, as it develops itself in space and time. The evil that man endures is evil at the time to him. He has to resist it, and by resistance to rise in the scale of virtue and intelligence. And that which is evil in the individual man, and which must everywhere be followed by its penal consequences, is yet not evil to an eye that could embrace the whole development of humanity. If pain and pleasure together make a happier and far richer world than pleasure only, if passions regulated by individual reason and by laws made by reasonable communities for their common guidance, form together a far higher world than would be produced by a set of uniform imperative intuitions, or by harmonious appetites and passions that needed no control, then surely we are justified in asserting that the presence of what we inevitably call evil, or moral evil, is not inconsistent with the proposition that the whole is good. God, the creator of the whole, has created only for the good of the whole. Universal laws and powers the whole of nature, or that supreme reason by which alone we can represent to ourselves the unity of nature. This declares itself on the side of happiness, and on the side of goodness, as both the highest happiness and the permanent guardian of happiness. Since in the entire scheme of creation, evil is subordinate to good, and humanity is the greater, and rises to higher and higher development owing to this admixture of good and evil, it follows that we cannot say of the author of the entire scheme that he is created for any other purpose than good. Nothing is evil in relation to the whole, and this becomes more impressed upon us when we regard humanity in its progressive character, and see how one generation is developed from another, how inevitably necessary the experience of many ages is to the wisdom of mankind, how the fierce pleasures and fantastic errors of one period are but the conditions of the calmer joys and more rational beliefs of a subsequent period. We live under this supreme reason, not under a being beneficent in the manner of a sympathetic man, who weeps at every calamity, rushes ever to the rescue, and burns at every injury. We live under a supreme intelligence, who has created in us, by the very spur of want, an intelligential power that combats with want. The presence of both good and evil is the condition of our intelligence, and again, this aroused intelligence has for its office to multiply and exalt the good, and as much as possible to subdue the evil. All the several parts of our creation form one scheme, and that scheme is beneficent. I am entitled to say this, although I am not entitled to say that other schemes of which I know nothing may not result in greater happiness and higher intelligence. If I had seen but one animal, I should be justified in admiring the harmony of its organization and the vivacity and pleasure of its movements, although I certainly should not have been entitled to say that an animal of still greater power or beauty or vivacity could not have been created. All who battle for the good are, in the language of a natural piety, the children of God. They are ranged on the side of goodness, or the production of happiness, and they also receive into their hearts as their indisputable reward the highest sentiments of happiness. If evil in some form or degree is eternally with us, this or that evil is not always necessary. Often it invites us to remedy or remove it by individual or combined efforts. Already some great evils that have afflicted society belong, with us, to the past. Others are prompting us forward by intimations that they also are vulnerable to attack. Yes, and there are irremediable evils: death and doubt, limitation to existence, limitation to knowledge. Such evils, I think, as have this character of being irremediably stamped upon them, are those also whose permanent place in human life seems distinctly justified by the nature of the whole. Something we must add on both classes, the remedial and the irremediable. Something we must also say of evil, as it is modified in our view by a belief in progress, and then we close this brief exposition. Remedial evils, or man progressive. Observe, it had not much consoled the race of mastodons to know, before they went to fossil, that anon their place would quicken with the elephant. They were not elephants, but mastodons, and I, a man as men are now, and not as men may be hereafter, feel with men in the agonizing present. So sings and wisely the authoress of Aurora Leigh. The pleasures of the coming elephant could not reconcile the mastodon to any trials he had to endure. I certainly could not attempt to console the present generation, if it needed to be consoled, by pointing to the superior happiness which will probably be attained by some subsequent generation, to bid one portion of the race to lie down patiently, as it were, in the breach, that another portion may pass over it into the citadel, might not be thought very kindly or acceptable advice. The idea of progress is a vast addition to the present life of all thinking men, to know that each age works not only for itself but for its successor, aggrandizes our conception of the whole of humanity. But each age has in itself its own completeness, its own harmonies, its own content. If it were not so, if the nature of life were to be miserable hitherto, I know not by what line of argument we should ever have established our idea of progress. Progress is not directly from bad to good, but from some good to a greater, from knowledge to knowledge, from effort to effort. Neither the idea of progress nor the doctrine of immortality, however much they add to the grandeur of our present lives by the emotions they occasion, or by the sublime views of human nature they justify, can be legitimately introduced as consolations for the miseries of the world at large. I know it is common to offer as consolation for the sufferings of this life the happiness of another, but the same religious faith which offers this consolation immediately afterwards limits it to the sufferings of the virtuous and the pious, or even to such of their sufferings as were due to their virtue or piety. Need I say how inadequate a consolation this is to the miseries of all the various classes of mankind? Men, it is true, may be contented with their lives upon the whole, and yet like to receive consolation for some unhappy portion of them, and to pious men this doctrine of a future life may offer the consolations they require. But, looking over the world at large, it is manifest that the greatest amount of misery is felt by those who, it is understood, are not entitled to the compensation of a happy futurity. Their greatest misery is that neither virtue nor piety have been cultivated within them. But to return to the idea of terrestrial progress, men extended their interest over the future of a human society even before our modern belief in progress had been developed. A Roman built for posterity, though he hoped for nothing higher than the continuance and stability of the Roman Commonwealth. Standing where we now do in the annals of time, we look back upon the past with the conviction that each age, while laboring and enjoying for itself, has been laying the foundation for higher labor and enjoyment in some future age. At least this has been always true of some nation, and what is done by one people is done for all the earth. Now, if anyone should here ask, why could not the last stage of human perfection have been at once attained? The answer is at hand. We have to repeat that human knowledge or wisdom is, from its very nature, built on that human experience which intervenes between the first and the last. You may perhaps conceive of some other kind of excellence, but this human excellence is, from its nature, the result of experience. How then could it be without that experience? If our spontaneity had from the first left us nothing to desire, we should never have been reflective beings at all. We should never have reflected, upon our whole lives, whatever we might have done upon inanimate nature. Reflection comes in with comparison, with preference, with approval and disapproval. It is, in fact, another term for comparison of a complex character. It is also plain that the reflection which a society makes upon its social or political organization must need the various experiences of several ages. I state this to show that it is a necessity of the case that one age should be subservient to another. It does not follow that either age is incomplete in itself. The progress may be from harmony to harmony, from one organization to another organization. Our latest social and political institutions might have been adopted at once, as the earliest may have been, by spontaneous impulses, with very little reflection. But in that case, they could not have been what they now are, the products of experience, and the constant subjects for the exercise of reason. Suppose we were all agreed that a representative form of government was the very best for human societies. How could such form of government be adopted by us, as reasonable creatures aware of its advantages, if men had not lived under other forms also, and if we were not capable of drawing a comparison between those other forms and this? We might, you say, have at once instituted such a government, guided by instinctive impulse, and if so, we should have lived under it as ants and bees under their form of polity, whatever that may be. Progress is brought about by the energy of man, which energy is also his highest felicity. The age which, in any way, has fought and conquered for its successor would perhaps be considered the more fortunate of the two, if its successor had not also its own strife at least to retain what had been thus acquired for it. The times of great wars and religious persecutions are not preeminently unhappy. In the first place, there were thousands whom the war or persecution never reached, who labored, loved, and married, and saw their children grow up and play about their knees. And, in the next place, those who were engaged in the war or persecution had their own fierce delights of doing and suffering, and defying the power that would crush them. I pity no one whose spirit is still unsubdued, who still combats and resists and strives. I have said something elsewhere of the evolution and development of human society and of human knowledge. I have endeavored to show how it is that we necessarily proceed through the mere dictates of passion and force to forms of society that are based on reflection, and through imaginative errors to truths that wear a scientific form. Slavery, war, despotism, religious persecution are evils which we have already partly outlived. Evils we, from our position, rightly pronounce them to be, yet each of them had its adaptation to the epoch in which it was found to exist, and each had a function to perform preparatory to a subsequent and happier era. Where they still exist, they still have the like adaptation. One illustration must here suffice. War is already, and has long been, proclaimed to be an evil of the first magnitude, and forward-looking men anticipate a time when the disputes of nations will be decided by a society of nations represented in some council or congress. Meanwhile, we are, as a people, still in that condition when we enjoyed the fierce delights of war. Nay, we read lectures to each other on the moral benefits arising out of the bold profession of arms. And, at all events, there is a general persuasion that this greater framer of states, this founder of nationalities, has not yet done its work. Wars of conquest and of self-defense have hitherto assisted at the formation of every well-knit community. The opposition from without has made the elements cohere within. Or perhaps religious persecution may afford us a better and more instructive illustration. Here our condemnation is still more decisive, and the evil, in its virulence, is regarded by us in England as belonging to the past. Yet the actions of the state of the civil power in upholding, amongst increasing multitudes, a faith generally beneficial to those multitudes is still recognized as a valuable element in our European societies. That action has changed its character and become more humane, and takes as often the form of bribery as of persecution. In a rude age, which at once on all subjects appealed to force, it inevitably assumed a rude and violent character. Men were put to death for not believing, or not professing, that national creed which had been made the basis of national education. If such a national creed, not founded on scientific knowledge, not capable in itself of fixing the belief of multitudes, has been upheld in this its useful, educational function by the power of the state, we must not altogether quarrel with religious persecution. At the same time, the more thinking part of a nation will outgrow such creeds. The martyr and the rebel inevitably appear upon the stage. Then new conceptions are gradually formed of the part which the state ought to take upon itself in this matter of religious belief. Each epoch thus brings about the state action that is fitted for it. Very terrible scenes may be, and have been, enacted in the transition. Men are divided by the direst animosities. Each party appears to the other in the blackest of colors, and yet each party is sustained by the very highest emotions of conscience and religious faith. There is a toleration for the persecutor we have yet to learn. I was lately reading the history of Philip II and the grand revolt of the Netherlands. What indignation I felt against the Spanish tyrant! And indeed, we Protestants must hate this despot. And yet, I asked myself, is it reasonable to lay upon one man, as his crime, the fanaticism of a whole people, and the tradition of ages? A great idea prevailed. It predominated entirely in Spain. It had prevailed generally over European society. It was the idea of a universal church, out of which salvation for the souls of men was impossible. Kings as well as priests, and mobs as well as kings, were possessed with this idea. Scholars, soldiers, magistrates, all held themselves charged to maintain it, to write, to fight, and adjudicate for its support. The error of all is the reproach of none. This Philip II is preeminently the great and pious king of pious Catholics. Possessed of highest power, on him devolves the severest task. The sword is in his hand, and he must strike. This morose and superstitious king is, before all others, a slave to our great idea. But in one part of his dominions, this great idea is disputed and dethroned. I see the enlightened and wealthy cities of Holland suffering every calamity that war and famine can inflict, rather than deny the new truth that has sprung up in them. They will not surrender their convictions. Rather let the sea take back their land. Rather let the fires of martyrdom consume their bodies. Return stroke for stroke, you brave Dutchmen. Bear all, inflict all, rather than surrender. Would that you could bind this monarch and fling him over your dikes, and be free to worship how you will. But now, when the fight is over and the combatants numbered with the dead, on whom are we to pass judgment? Not on the zealot king, not on the zealot citizen. They are gone from before our judgment seat with all their antagonistic energies and repugnant duties. They have left only for our contemplation a contest between two great ideas. All that remains for us is to congratulate ourselves on the new views that have become prevalent as to the duty of the state in the matter of religion. But here we perceive our age may justly congratulate itself, and yet not condemn or affect to pity its predecessor. An enlightened people, a people whose minds are generally active, will put forth a variety of beliefs, and this very activity of mind becomes a substitute for that state authority which it resists. Among such a people, the action of the state is necessarily and wisely limited. Did such mental activity become still more general, the action of the state might be altogether withdrawn. All this is subject for sincere congratulation. But if I am to look back candidly into some past era, I must see there also a certain harmony in the condition of things, a certain social organization which is not unworthy of admiration. An ignorant, unreasoning people are bound together, and have their minds guided and enriched by some state-protected faith, which, be its composition what it may, has in it the highest practical wisdom that the thinking few of mankind have hitherto attained. This also is not unworthy of an approving recognition.